start up again, I wanted to have the class discuss a couple of questions. So I'll take over for 2 minutes and then turn it back to you.
Okay, perfect. And I'll speed up because I want to make sure we get the political stuff in.
We'll be starting up again in 3 minutes. Okay, we're almost to 5:15. There are a couple of things I wanted to cover. First of all, this session is being recorded, so if you missed any part of it or want to review a particular portion after it is posted, it'll be posted both on Blackboard, and once we figure out the mechanics this week, we will post it on YouTube, and I'll send that information to you. So, and Connie, are you willing to share your slides? Can I share them with the class? Okay, so we'll post Connie's slides. There was a request for that. So when Stephen Corey or Dennis Judd or Terry Clark or some of our other urban scholars tell the story of Chicago, they may begin at a different place and they may tell it a different way and they may tell different things about it. But I wanted to start with this question of social conditions and the social challenges of Chicago, and just make sure we tried to organize the 21st Century Chicago book this way. And it's a theme that all scholars of Chicago pretty much focus on in one way or the other. So I wanted to take just 2 or 3 minutes and ask you, what is the most important social condition and challenge in the city of Chicago? Based on all your reading and based on Connie's presentation so far. More to come with Connie. Anyone? Just unmute and quickly answer so we can move on, so Connie has the time.
I would say economics. I mean, not, I'm sorry, employment.
Okay, that's an answer. We're going to come back. Others?
Political corruption.
That's another topic.
I think it's the connection between race and poverty and the way it has created an underclass.
Yes, so all those other things, like we looked at the health system, or we looked at the crime problems, or we looked at this or that or the other, or we look at things, when we're talking about the social circumstances, this connection between race and poverty is central to Chicago, and that's one of the things Chicago scholars particularly focus on, because we don't have any choice. It's the reality of the city. So we try and organize, that's why we do things like present facts like segregation index and so forth, is to try and understand that. So I want us to, as we go through each section, the social, the economic, the political, and the governmental, one of the things we try and do is to find a way to pull it all together. So when we're talking, for instance, in the chapter that deals with the psychological reasons that residential segregation occurs, we fit it within that same pattern. Race matters, the connection between the economy and race matter, and so forth. And so, Connie, I'm going to let you pick up with the next part of the presentation, and we'll come back to more discussion as we go, I'm sure.
You're muted. There we go. Thank you. All right. So, and I want to go relatively quickly through some of these last slides on the social challenges facing Chicago and that connection between race and poverty, because I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about politics. But where I'd left off was that concentric model, right? That Burgess had developed, that wealth increased the further you were away from the city core, and poverty was concentrated in the city core. And so we certainly see that in 1980. It's not perfect, but that model's still holding somewhat in 1980. Now, if we were to look, the last time it was mapped was 2017, which is recent enough for us to take a look at, we see dramatic differences. So when we look at household income, we see it increasing in the downtown center and along the north side, greatly expanded just from where it was in the 1980s. That's a huge difference in household income. When you look at home values, where are home values going up? The downtown, the north side, a little bit in the South Loop, and this correlates again to educational levels. And so we're seeing almost the reverse happening of this concentric model that held pretty well as explaining development in Chicago through the 1980s to today, with wealth concentrated more towards the center of the city. And when we've talked about Chicago, this is often overused, and I even use it in the title of one of the chapters that I write in the book about Chicago's education system, but Chicago being a tale of two cities. Some have referred to Chicago as being Manhattan, smashed up against Detroit. And part of this, there's many reasons. You guys were hitting on it. Our book covers a lot of it. The economic restructuring that's happening. What we have in Chicago is an hourglass economy. And by an hourglass economy, what we mean is that wealth is increasing, poverty is increasing, and the middle class is shrinking. And manufacturing has dramatically decreased in Chicago. So these good paying sort of union wage jobs have disappeared by 41%. You can go back to 1960 and you find that 33% of Black workers are employed in manufacturing. Today, it's only 5%. One of the things that strikes me as somebody who's an advocate for public transportation are the inequalities in transportation throughout the Chicago region. There's over 700,000 jobs located within a 30-minute commute on public transportation from the Loop and the North Side. On the south side, there's just 50%, or sorry, 50,000 jobs within a 30-minute commute. These are pretty dramatic differences. So all of you urban planners, think about what that means and how we make jobs and access to those jobs more available for people that live on the south side of Chicago. One of the theories that you're going to, yeah, good, Tony. Yes, it's systemic. It's entrenched. You're exactly right. One of the theories that you're going to read about, you're going to hear a lot about in this class is, the growth machine, urban growth machines. And this is a way of understanding urban politics. And it's one in which growth and development are seen as being necessary for the economic health of the city. But creating those conditions in and of itself is political. And what we have seen happen in Chicago, in every global city, this isn't even just unique to the United States. We see the same things in London, in Tokyo, in Paris, where we have pursued neoliberal, corporate growth-centered economic development in the downtown and in Chicago on the north side, to promote corporate growth, residential growth, and we've shifted priorities away from maximizing the social welfare of the citizens that live in the city, and instead focused on, attracting corporate investment and tourism. And one of the questions that I hope that you all will keep in mind as you go throughout this course is, who is the city for? Who has the right to the city? What is a just city? What does it mean to be a just city, and who is the city for? And I think that context will add a lot to your understanding as we think about urban politics and the theories and the models and the frameworks that we use to explain urban politics. And so we've used this term over and over, Chicago being a tale of two cities. Well, as one of the articles in your book talks about, really we're three cities. And what we're seeing is a deepening divide in income inequality. And we see really strong spatial patterns within the city. And this map will explain it. So let's go back to the 1970s when my family was living in the Lakeview area of Chicago. About 50% of the city's census tracts were what we would consider middle income. My family was probably living somewhere in here in a low income area at the time. But 50% of the census tracts were considered middle income. Now let's take a look to a more recent map in 2017 and what's happened to the middle class. What are you guys noticing?
It just became all red. There's not enough middle class people.
Yeah, it's shrinking because the middle class is shrinking economically as wealth increases and poverty increases. But there's also spatially residential. Where do the middle class live? Chicago's a city of the very rich and the very poor. If you're middle class in Chicago, you end up living on the far northwest side of the city, or in my case, on the far southwest side of the city of Chicago. Not maybe because that's your desired neighborhood, but it's where you can afford to live if you make a middle class income. And so we're seeing the middle class being shrunk both spatially and economically. Cardinal George talked about, and we include this quote in the book, and it was something that really resonated with me, and I'm not Catholic, but it resonated with me when he talked about spatial racism, and that the face of racism looks different today than it did 30 years ago. Overt racism is easily condemned, but the sin is often with us in more subtle forms. Spatial racism refers to the patterns of metropolitan development in which some affluent whites create racially and economically segregated suburbs or gentrified areas of cities, leaving the poor, mainly African Americans, Hispanics, and some newly arrived immigrants, isolated in deteriorating areas of the cities and older suburbs. And this really rang true to me as describing what we've experienced in Chicago. And we can see this manifest itself in numerous ways. And I'm not going to spend, good Sean, a ton of time talking about it because I want to get to the politics. But Chicago has the largest life expectancy gap of any big city in the United States. And so if you live in Streeterville, average age, you're going to live to be about 90 years old, the average person. But just 11 miles away in Inglewood, 11 miles. It's not very far. On a good day, I'll ride my bicycle 11 miles and not think about it, right? That's not a long distance. The average age in Inglewood is only 60 years of age. And we can look at things like smoking rates, obesity rates. We still see these following these same patterns of segregation and systemic racism in Chicago. And not surprisingly, we also see it in terms of environmental burdens and where these burdens fall most heavily within the city of Chicago. Same thing with food accessibility, food insecurity, the same exact patterns we see over and over again. And I'll share these slides with you, but this shouldn't be a huge surprise to you guys that we see these patterns repeating themselves in multiple different ways. One of the things that I looked at, I was really interested in, I had a student doing some research on this, was COVID cases and how that was connected to redlining and segregation in Chicago. And this map is back to October of 2020 was when we got the screenshots of these maps. But you can look at COVID cases throughout the city, but then you look at where the COVID deaths were happening. They were happening you could lay that HOLC map over this and see exactly where the deaths were happening in previously redlined areas. And when the vaccines first started being available to folks back in February of 2021, who was getting them? Who was getting the vaccines? Where that wealth is now concentrated, on the north side and downtown. So, this isn't some theoretical, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, redlining. This isn't just theory. This isn't something that happened years ago. This is something that is still impacting the daily lives of those of us that live in the city of Chicago each and every day. And we see the same thing, homicides, gun-related deaths, all of these things are correlated. So I'll end there. I kind of went through those last slides quickly. I'm sure none of that is a surprise to many of you, but I'll share my slides with all of you afterwards. And I'm going to jump into what the political challenges facing Chicago in the 21st century Chicago, and what we identify in our book as being the major political challenges facing Chicago in the 21st century are the continued legacy of machine politics and corruption. Now, maybe there's a debate, are machine politics over? I don't know. We're going to talk a little bit about that. How many of you are familiar with the term machine politics? I probably should ask how many of you are not familiar with it instead, right? Missy, can you help me out? I can't see the whole screen. Does it look like everybody understands machine politics or no?
Maybe we give a little refresher.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, so machine politics. Machine politics, when we look at industrialized cities, our first cities, we can look at Boston, we can look at Cleveland, we can look at Kansas City, we can look at Chicago. Lots of cities, as they were developing in the industrial age, machine politics developed. The very basic model of machine politics, this is very basic, and I'm going to take you to a much more advanced model before we're done here today. But this is the very basic model, is that you have some sort of political boss, right? And this political boss doles out, it can be the mayor. It doesn't always have to be the mayor. More times than not it is, but there are cases where it's not. where the political boss doles out favors, doles out jobs. This translates into money. This translates into votes that keeps the political boss in office. Importantly, a machine is an economic exchange. Okay, it's an economic exchange in which people are benefiting. They're benefiting by getting favors, or they're getting the jobs, or the salary that keeps the person, the machine running.
Connie, for those
Before I
that
go on,
come
Dick, you
from,
want to jump in?
just on, for those who are from South America or other third world countries, this is sometimes in the comparative literature called clientism.
Good.
Same concept.
Yep. Okay. All right, so that's the basic model. We'll go through a little bit more in detail. For those of you that aren't as familiar with Chicago, just a quick refresher on the governmental structure of Chicago. Chicago is divided into 50 geographical wards. These are single member wards, meaning that just one person represents the ward. It's, similar if you're thinking about a congressional district, a legislative district, we call them wards. They're legislative districts. There's 50 of them. There's approximately 60,000 people that live in each ward. Of that, about 30,000, about half are actual voters eligible to vote. And each ward in Chicago elects one alderman, and they are elected through nonpartisan elections, meaning that they don't run on the ballot as a Democrat or Republican. Being Chicago, we tend to know whether they're Democrat or Republican, but technically they run in a nonpartisan election. Chicago has had nonpartisan city council elections since the 1920s. We did get nonpartisan mayoral elections in the 1990s. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Each ward then is further divided into precincts, and each ward has, depending on the ward, 24 to 60 precincts. When I looked it up, it was the lowest was 24, somebody had 60. You can probably find the median somewhere in between there. Each precinct is about 4 to 10 blocks in size, average about 350 voters in each precinct. The ward boss, usually the alderman, not always, but usually the alderman, sometimes they're also the committeemen, appoints precinct captains and assistant precinct captains. So here is a map, geographical map of Chicago's wards. And at some point, there's not time for it today, but Dick and I could both talk to you about the politics of where these lines are drawn and the remapping project. Dick had me work on a project for him when I was in graduate school that ended up getting me subpoenaed into court and having to file testimony after research I'd done about how these, the voting behavior of different aldermen and why that mattered to where these district lines were drawn. But here, and we're coming up on that now, and it's interesting politics. Exactly, Mitch. It's interesting stuff to watch.
Professor, are you going to share that report with us?
Which
the one that got you in court? I'd like to see that.
Dick, do you still even have that? That was so many years ago. Was it it was after the 1990s remap?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was a very simple study. First was done by the Urban League, and then that I and Connie did. And basically what it ended up proving, which would seem self-evident, is that representatives from different racial groups, Black, white, Latino, there were no Asian city council members, voted differently. And therefore it made a difference whether African Americans were able to elect an alderman of their choice or not, and the same for whites and Latinos. Because we had to prove that that these district lines have some effect. Otherwise, the court case wouldn't have won. So that's that, and it was a 15-page report. And yes, we did get in every remap since 1960, with one exception, the courts have proven that the remap has promoted segregation in one form or another.
It was really interesting, but it was like several years afterwards that I kept getting subpoenas. I'd get served at work. Somebody would come and bring me a subpoena for, work that I had done years ago. But it was really interesting and fully engaged me that I watch all of this redistricting at all levels with heightened interest. And you're right, we're about to hit it again. Here's just an example of the 32nd Ward and their precinct map. For comparison's sake, New York City has 51 city council districts. We have 50. They have 51, and their population is 8.4 million, and we're just under 3 million. So for comparison, I'm looking at New York City, also looking for comparison to LA. LA only has 15 city council districts. Some of that has to do with the geographical, how LA developed, but they've got a larger population as well at 4 million. And when we look at different forms of city government in the United States, we see a mayor council form of government. And within a mayor council form of government, there can either be a strong mayor form of government or a weak mayor form of government within a mayor council. If someone were to ask you today, does Chicago have a strong mayor or a weak mayor? What would you say?
I would say she's not as strong as the others, but she's trying to be.
Well, think structurally. Let's take the personality out of it. Structurally, are we structured in a strong mayor form of government? The mayor has many more powers, can veto things, usually appoints people like the city clerk and the treasurer. In a weak mayor, they don't have as many powers. Alicia, you've got your hand up according to my screen.
I do. So I believe that Mayor Lightfoot is a strong mayor, but I think the strategies that are being forced upon her are the same that Harold Washington went through when he was a mayor. So I think that she, as far as books are concerned, she's considered a weak mayor because the council obviously is overruling her. But I think because she's a woman and because she's a minority, that she is being treated very differently than a male counterpart.
So what I would say is let's not confuse personality and the person in the position with the structure and what our city charter directs. Is Chicago structurally set up as a strong mayor or a weak mayor form of government? And I can't see whoever raised their, I know somebody raised their hand, but I'm not seeing it. So just talk.
It's a weak mayor form structurally, which coming from Houston, it's been shocking to see the differences in the powers of the mayor office.
How so?
So Houston's the largest city in the US with a strong mayor system, and being accustomed to a mayor who just has broad powers to call the shots. It's interesting to see how contested policy is in Chicago.
Right. So technically Chicago, by our charter, which is like a constitution that sets up the organization of our city, technically we have a weak mayor form of government. Now, we've had really strong personalities in that position, which will lead people to believe we have a strong mayor form of government. But structurally, we have a weak mayor form of government, which can, and some of you were already hinting at this, the city council didn't exert as much of its influence over Richard M. Daley, or certainly not Richard M. Daley, or Richard J. Daley, or Rahm Emanuel, but we're starting to see a little bit of that with the Lightfoot administration. Whereas we just had rubber stamp councils with many of them as well. Who else has got their hand up? Missy, if you can help call on people, because because I've got the full screen, I can't see the.
I think Tony, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I raised my hand because I get where the point is coming from, a weak mayoral system, but a lot of times when we're talking about policy, it is the line of nepotism and friendship that goes into play when certain people are in position. like you say, you talked about Daley, and we would have different mayors that maybe had a stronger voice, but a lot of things that they're kind of allowed to do is based on relationship that they may have with other people in different positions. That kind of really goes back to that political machine, aspect or theory, like when certain powers that be, if every time I look at politics and city structures, even though I live here in Rockford, I always look at, where the money is, right? So who in the city has the money, or who's dealing with a lot of constructural things, hands in different areas of education, and that tends to kind of show, based on the circles that they interact with, who has leeway and leverage to do certain things. And we're talking about politics, and that's just people in power. So who has the power, and what's that person's relationship to the people in the power?
Good. So yeah, you're right. And it's about how they amass power. And there's different ways of amassing power, whether that's through relationship building or building huge campaign coffers. There's different ways to amass power that may circumvent the actual charter structure. Good.
To
So you
Connie's
have two
point,
other
the,
hands up, Alicia and Wujay. So Alicia, did you have a comment or question?
or it's still up.
Wujay?
So Chicago is a weak mayoral system because the mayor has to submit plans to the city council. Is that right?
Yes, and our treasurer and our city clerk are elected independently as opposed to being appointed positions.
And Daniel, I think he mentioned Houston. Is that an example of a strong mayoral system that mayor does not submit anything? He just says, "This is what we're going for," and the city, "Oh, hey, you have a chart right afterwards." All right.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't break it down. I was wondering whether I broke it down by strong or weak. It's just within the mayor council form of local government. You will see either strong mayor or weak mayor, and it's different depending on each city, how they've actually written their city charter and how they have it structured. Houston's a whole other case. I would love to talk to you more about zoning in Houston. Like they have a house built out of beer cans or something like that. And I don't know, it doesn't seem like it would hold up well to hurricanes, but that's a whole other subject. Anybody else have their hands up?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, good. All right, so what we see, we can look at some of the major cities across the United States, and we see the top ones: New York, LA, Chicago, all have a mayor council form of government. And then we see places like Phoenix that have a council manager form of government. The council manager form of government developed after the progressive era of the late 1800s, early 1900s, as a way to bring more efficiency, a more business-like environment to government. So you're going to see it in newer cities in the West and a lot of suburban communities where the city council actually goes out and hires many of you public administration folks. This may be your career goal. I can tell you that I'd probably be making a heck of a lot more money if I was using my MPA instead of my PhD. And you may have the goal of becoming a city manager, where the city council goes out, hires a professional city manager. Typically, they have a master's degree in public administration, and they run the day-to-day functioning of the city. Sometimes there will be a mayor, but they're largely ceremonial. Elmhurst, where I teach, has a council manager form of government. The mayor's completely ceremonial. I think he makes $5,000 a year, something like that. Good. Oh, really, Daniel? Very interesting. Very interesting. All right. So when we look at Chicago elections, we talked about the 50 wards. we do have runoff elections. So if no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, that will force it into a runoff, because we don't have primaries in the traditional sense, right? Where you have all the Democrats running against each other, all the Republicans running against each other, and whoever wins goes on to the general election. Our elections are nonpartisan. So that means that you could have 20 people run for mayor, which means it's not likely that anybody's going to get over 50% of the vote. And so if no one gets over 50% of the vote for any of our aldermanic offices, or also the mayor's office, the top two then go on to a runoff election. And in Chicago, as I already talked about, the mayor, the city clerk, the treasurer, they're each elected independently. Chicago used to have partisan primaries prior to 1995. Now the mayor is just like the aldermanic elections. They're nonpartisan, and you have to clear the 50% threshold. Richard J. Daley, for example, always had over 50% in each one of his elections and never faced a runoff. Rahm Emanuel was the first one to face a runoff election. And you guys read about this. I won't spend a lot of time about this on this, but the different eras, you read about the different eras of Chicago politics. Importantly, we started to see a progressive regime developing under Mayor Harold Washington, who unfortunately died in office. Then we had some chaos. Then we start to see, the new machine of Richard J. Daley, a rubber stamp council, where the council, even though it's a weak mayor, where the council just rubber stamps, approves whatever it is the mayor wants. We start to see a return of that. Then we start to see the Rahm Emanuel machine, which we refer to in the book as the money machine. Importantly, Rahm Emanuel had an even stronger rubber stamp council than Richard J. Daley did. And now it seems as if we're heading into another progressive era. So while some progressives in Chicago have certainly taken issue with Mayor Lori Lightfoot, we are entering into a more progressive era of Chicago politics. And I'll talk about some of the nitty-gritty stuff with this. Chicago has had, going back to political machines, Chicago has had a political machine since the Chicago fire. New York, Boston all had Democratic machines. Chicago's first machine, and many people don't know this, was a Republican machine. It was first a Republican machine. The Democratic machine was really perfected under Cermak and then later Richard J. Daley. Machines get their power. They've got different sources of strength. There's carrots and there's sticks. One is patronage, the jobs that they're able to dole out. Richard J. Daley had over 35,000 jobs at his disposal, favors, city contracts. The sticks, of course, are if you don't go along with the machine, maybe there's, a city inspector that shows up to your business or to your home, or you lose particular benefits, or you don't get a nice new, Chicago City garbage can. All right, so back to that basic model of the Chicago or of political machines, very basic. If we think about it as an organizational structure, we can think about the boss, the mayor, the party leader on top, the alderman, then the precinct captains underneath. And Richard J. Daley and Dick, since Dick, you served under Richard J. Daley and you fought his machine, would you mind stepping in and telling us what that was like?
Sure. So Richard J. Daley perfected the rubber stamp city council. Even though some of them that followed Richard M. and Rahm Emanuel also had rubber stamp city councils. When Daley started, there were 14 Republican aldermen in the city council out of 50. When Daley ended, or right after the Daley regime, 2 years later, there were no Republican aldermen left in the city council. So we were all Democrats of one stripe or another. The independent bloc varied in size. For many years in the 1960s, there was only one independent alderman, and that was Leon Dupre from the 5th Ward on the south side of Chicago. In the early period of the 60s, there were 6 African-American aldermen who served. They were called the Silent Six. And the Negro Digest said of them that the only Negro representative in the city council was Alderman Leon Dupre, who was white, serving the 5th Ward of Chicago, a liberal independent alderman, and the one independent for a long time. Time I joined the city council in 71, the longer the block grew to about 7, and we could get sometimes as many as 14 votes on issues. But we were greatly outnumbered, and Daley became more tyrannical the longer he stayed in office. He became a more and more powerful boss. He undercut his enemies, both originally in the Republican Party and within the Democratic Party. He did use his power to build up Chicago, but he built it up mainly in the downtown. This was as the city was deteriorating as the late part of the industrial era, and downtown had become decrepit in many ways, and Daley was able to bring the loop back, but it was not a politics that served well. There was what was called a submachine, which was the black wards on the south side and later the west side of Chicago. The machine did break on racial lines. In those days, there was a big competition between the ethnic groups. There were quite a few Polish aldermen, Irish aldermen. You knew who was who by their ethnicity, and those, but they were all subservient to Richard J. Daley. So he is properly called. The book I use in the Chicago's Future class at UIC, the undergraduate class is Boss. So if you want to read a description of Mayor Daley, this book by Mike Royko is an inside kind of view of how it was in a single day in the life of Richard J. Daley and what it was like with the city council and the other elements of the city at the time.
Thanks, Dick. And that gets to the point. A lot of what it wasn't about ideology necessarily or the way the machine politics worked. It was an economic exchange in many ways. It wasn't necessarily opposing sides or principles. It was about amassing power and economic benefit. What Royko points out, oops, and I'm sorry, somebody's got their hand up.
Mitch.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to ask a couple kind of things on that. And I think we might talk about this in the corruption pieces. And I mean, as we're talking about the machine, but, you know, even from the J. Daley, and because you know, political power, obviously the city council has the ability, as we kind of just talked about, to do whatever it wants, basically, or at least fight against the mayor if it so could amass the power to do so. So, you know, throughout the J. Daley and M. Daley, I mean, all the way up through kind of Ram, like we basically have had city council that lets the mayors do whatever they want, except for a couple exceptions like with Washington and whatnot. I mean, are we, during all of that time, you know, the city was never able to amass a proper opposition? Or was it really that that deeply entrenched that there was never the ability to amass proper opposition and like get the investment into the parts of the city where it needed it?
So it's a very complicated history if you go back to 1871. Originally, there were small fiefdoms in each of the wards, and they formed themselves into what were called rings in the city council, which were allied with each other, and the decisions were made mostly in the city council. For instance, the CTA was blocked for 40 years because of rich people who owned the transportation system wanting to shake down the riders, and it was impossible for mayors to overcome that, even though having a single unified public transportation system made sense. But there was always an opposition movement. There, in the 1920s, it was the Republican progressives primarily who provided the opposition. By the time I was there in the city council, it was the independent Democrats. But it was a battle every single time, both at the ward level and at the mayoral level. And the machine stayed dominant with the exception of the Harold Washington period up until the current Lori Lightfoot era.
The key, I think, too, is remember that Connie said, how many jobs that they controlled. And so it wasn't just 35,000 lives, right? It was their families, their friends, whomever else, that they could help, or who thought that they were going to get that job. So it had a, reverberation effect. And some of these people were scared that they would lose their job or that there would be some sort of retaliation.
So from, just one follow-up on that, from like a public engagement perspective and, voting and everything. I mean, a lot of, obviously there were, the machines included the huge ward organizations and there was, the precinct and everything. I mean, was it that prevalent that there was really no ability for, to oust, I guess, if you will, some machine candidates in order to get candidates in there that would actually represent your ward well? Or was there just enough economic benefit coming into the wards where it appeased, people for the most part that they didn't, really kind of create the opposition that they needed?
Well, let me speak from just running in the 44th ward. To be able to win the 44th ward election, I had to have more than 300 volunteers to work the 60 precincts. Now, not the whole time, but particularly by election day. So, if we took this class and one of you said, I want to run for alderman or I want to run for mayor, would you be able to get 300 people to work the precincts necessary to win in a single ward? It gets much worse if you're running citywide. You need, in short terms, 9,000 volunteers or workers. Now, the machine can get that by giving out jobs, but if you're running as a candidate, you have to convince people to work with you. Sean, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how does voter apathy play into this? So, to kind of what Mitch was touching on, in order to overturn some of these incumbents, I mean, obviously you would need to, I guess, flip the people that have, strongly voted and supported, kind of the patronage. But at the same time, so for example, as a whole, like the ward I live in, I've looked at the last 4 elections, and the alderman that's here is a longstanding alderman, almost going on 20 years, and she's won with like 30% of the vote. Most of the ward is not voting, there, and she keeps winning off of that. So what would you say to that, Professor Simpson, about, kind of turning a situation like that, where I'm sure there's some patronage that's going on, but at the same time, voter apathy in the community is pretty low, or pretty high, I guess.
So you build it up over time. First of all, getting volunteers and everything. You can't win, if you decide to run this week for an election, next week you're going to lose, particularly if you're running against incumbents. So you have to build it up from multiple elections. When we organized the north side of Chicago, we had 7 wards in the 9th Congressional District at the time, and we were able to move people between wards. But we still had to win election by election. We didn't start by, we actually started trying to win the presidential election with Eugene McCarthy or Bobby Kennedy in 1968, and we lost. We lost badly. The delegates to the Democratic Convention in 1968, there were 114 daily delegates and 4 independent delegates in 1968. We built up a base over time and we began to win elections, but it wasn't a single time. It took an effort. So if you were going to run in your ward, I would say you should be involved in the elections coming up now and build up an organization that lacks the same kinds of candidates to be able to run in 2023. But we can come back to that later. I'm going to let Connie pick up the story.
And I think Dick has a book called Winning Elections that might be helpful for those purposes. So between the 2 dailies, we had Blandick, Byrne, Harold Washington. In the Harold Washington progressive era, we did see council wars particularly during his first term, where you had 21 aldermen supporting the mayor, you had 29 aldermen, white aldermen, importantly, in opposition. He was able to amass more of a majority in his second term, but unfortunately passed away. Eugene Sawyer. I'm going to jump to Daley. I want to leave enough time for discussion, so I'm going to run through some of this a little bit quickly, and we can come back to it next week too. Richard M. Daley served 1 year longer than his father in office before voluntarily retiring, which surprised the heck out of me that he retired. He had a different city. Less federal money was flowing into the city during his term. The demographics of the city were changing, but he also had a strong rubber stamp council. He'd appointed 19 of the 50 aldermen. And remember that very basic model that I had shown you guys of machine politics starts to get a little more complicated with Richard M. Daley. So Richard J. Daley had sort of that basic model, more or less. And we look at Richard J. Daley. Importantly, what we start to see coming into the machine, into his machine, is the global industry as we're becoming a more global world in the 1990s. Transnational corporations, business, law firms, the financial sector, real estate, contracts, money, consultants, all of this starts feeding into the machine, along with ward organizations and precinct work. So like his father, he did depend on the precinct work and the ward organizations, but it had this other layer of a dependence on corporate and wealthy individuals donating to the campaign. And also, rather than just that, my grandfather and uncle were precinct captains, for example, under both Daleys. And their jobs depended on them getting out the vote. Richard M. Daley went beyond that, beyond the door-to-door army of patronage workers, to the TV commercials, the mailers that went out that really hadn't existed. So he advanced the machine in that way. Many referred to his machine as pinstripe patronage, which, you know, was the precinct worker, but workers, but also dependent on campaign dollars. In 2007, I think a lot of us who study Chicago politics shook our head in disbelief that Daley had spent $3.3 million on re-election. It's gone up significantly since then, but most of his money was coming from real estate developers, city contracts, who were getting benefits. Remember how that machine works. And a lot of like construction workers, construction unions, electrical, plumbing, and then we see the global economic sectors playing a role. And what we start to see during the Richard M. Daley era is this move away from our industrial manufacturing past. And, you know, he says those factories aren't coming back. We're going to have to look to the financial markets, baking, being a hub for global transportation. And remember that term I used before about urban growth machine, right? This theory or framework of looking at urban politics. Well, we see it. We really see it during the Richard M. Daley administration. The expansion of Navy Pier, McCormick Place, United Center, Cellular Field, now it's Guaranteed Rate Stadium, Millennium Park, over budget, 4 years behind, the museum campus, subsidies going to corporations like Boeing, which, by the way, Boeing only brought 100 top executives. They didn't bring manufacturing here. They just brought 100 top executives, and they got $64 million in subsidies from the city. The Shackman decrees. Missy, do you want to give them a 2-minute? I kind of want to I know they've read it and I know we're tight on time, but since you wrote the article on Shackman, do you want to jump in with anything?
I guess just to say, I think to the question earlier about how could this sort of machine system persist, part of it was that there was no way to legally to stop it, right? Who is going to tell Richard J. Daley that you can't give a job to your friend, right? There's no law on the books. So Michael Shackman, who was an independent, who wanted to run to be on the 1970 con for the Illinois Constitution, sued essentially and said, very basically, you know, you shouldn't, you should be qualified for the job that you work, but also that people who are employed by the city of Chicago shouldn't be doing political work on city time. You're a garbage collector, Constitutional Convention, I'm sorry. If you're a garbage collector for the city of Chicago, you should be picking up garbage. You shouldn't be knocking on doors. You shouldn't be registering voters. You shouldn't be doing all of that stuff. Also, people who do this work shouldn't get perks at their city jobs. They shouldn't be fired because they declined to do this work. And so Shackman's work essentially is to get federal judges to say in the United States Supreme Court to say that, you know, political hiring and firing is illegal. And also that having, you know, workers do work on their time on the clock is also illegal. So by the time that Richard M. Daley becomes mayor, these decisions have been made in the federal courts, which is why that second slide that Connie showed you about the machine becomes so large and confusing. And the machine is very adept. It's good at switching things up. So Richard M. Daley didn't have the same ability. He found a new way to do it. He didn't have the same ability to hire and fire people as his father did, but instead he set up neighborhood organizations to do the same thing. I also worked for an alderman. My alderman was raised by the Hispanic Democratic Organization, which was a pretend organization really, that was set up in order to bring in Latinos who were becoming a larger part of the Chicago population at the time. So the alderman that I worked for was essentially raised by the Polish machine, learned his way, but his parents were Mexican American or Mexican immigrants, I'm sorry. And he became part of the Hispanic Democratic Organization. And when there was a spot in the first ward, he was appointed to that. He wasn't elected, he was elected afterwards, but he was part of that machine, right? What court case, what law could prevent that sort of thing from going on, right? That's a little bit more difficult, but this sort of cracking at the institutional mechanisms that allowed the machine to persist didn't begin until 1969 and until Shackman, went to court and said, that this is taxpayer dollars, that stuff is illegal.
There was a question in the chat about didn't civil service prevent all of this? Wasn't it always illegal? And the answer is no. Civil service, the Hatch Act applies to the federal government, was adopted 100 years earlier, but did not apply to city and local government. So patronage was legal until the Shackman cases and a case in the state of Illinois that eventually called the Rutan decision. Those two decisions made patronage illegal for the first time in the local and state government.
So what we saw during the Richard M. Daley administration, there were 30 federal indictments. You guys can read more about it, the hired truck scandal, some of the other ones. Chicago has this legacy of corruption. And Dick, what are we up to now within the aldermen? This was only through 2017. Do we have 2 or 3 more that we're adding?
So this slide's a little out of date.
It's out of date. I realized that when it went up.
Yeah.
I'm like, I didn't update this before today.
Yeah, so there have now been more than 2,100 public officials convicted of corruption in Illinois and more than 1,800 in Chicago and the metropolitan region. There are now 35 aldermen who have gone to federal prison for public corruption, and there are 4 cases pending currently of aldermen. So if they all get convicted, we'll soon hit the magic number of 40. There are only 50 aldermen. Since I was alderman, there've only been about 200 serve in the city council. So one way of putting that is we have the worst crime rate of any neighborhood of Chicago as the city council chambers.
Yeah, thank you, Dick. I looked at it right before class and I knew this one was outdated. And I'm like, I'm just going to ask Dick. He's going to know that off the top of his head. And Dick also had this appeared in the Reader, that they made a graphic about what the corruption, what you could buy with the dollars lost due to corruption in Chicago. And they used a lot of Dick's data. So I thought it was worth giving you guys this image. So the price of corruption in some areas, the city looks better. City services some places operate more efficiently. But who is the city for? This goes back to that question that I asked you guys about at the very beginning. Who has the right to the city? Who is the city for? Not everybody is enjoying the same benefits of the global city that Chicago became under Richard M. Daley. The Rahm Emanuel administration, and I want to be sensitive to time, was a continuation of the machine of Richard M. Daley's machine, but almost on steroids. In his first election, remember when I said 3.3 seemed like a lot of money? In his first election, he raised $12 million. Then it was $18 million. In his second election, he was forced into a pretty humbling runoff, but ultimately ended up winning that runoff election and then opted not to run again into 2019, but he largely continued Richard M. Daley's policies of catering to the wealthy global elite, spending on amenities and subsidies for the elite, lots of cuts to basic public services, particularly mental health, public transportation, really draconian cuts that hurt communities of color that are already struggling between what we started with today, that connection between race and poverty, and also, increasing tax rates. And, by bureaucratic measures, sometimes Rahm Emanuel looks like a success, but it's really only a success if you live downtown or on the north side of Chicago. Now, this is the model that we put forward to explain the Rahm Emanuel machine, and we call it a money machine. And what you can see here is that the mayor doles out in three important areas: city contracts, public policies, and urban amenities. And, these go to building contractors or unions. You guys can read about this. I'm not going to spend time because I'd spend the rest of the class talking about direct voucher payments. But let me tell you, when I wrote that part of it, I spent days, and it was fascinating stuff, learning about where this direct voucher payments were going, largely to the global businesses, wealthy individuals. All of this turns into campaign donations. Now, unlike his predecessors, Rahm Emanuel was not as dependent on the ward organizations. His was very much a money machine. There was some ward organization support, but his power came, bottom line, from his ability to raise money and reward his supporters in city council and punish those who did not support him. That's where his power came from. And so as we look ahead beyond the Daleys, beyond Rahm Emanuel, to where we are today, to the Lori Lightfoot administration, and we look at her election, and prior to Rahm Emanuel saying that he wasn't going to run again, there were a few people in the race. Some of them we really hadn't heard of, including probably Lori Lightfoot for a majority of Chicagoans, right? There weren't any big names that were willing to take Rahm Emanuel on. As soon as Rahm Emanuel says he's not going to run again, we get some bigger names. We get Bill Daley. We get Gary Chico. We get Susanna Mendoza. Some bigger names decide to enter the race. And remember, it's nonpartisan. So the general election in February has got all 14 of these candidates running. It's not partisan, it's a general election. So we knew going into it that it was very unlikely that anyone would get 50% of the total, and there would be a runoff election, which was held in April. And it ended up being Lori Lightfoot and Tony Preckwinkle. And you can see from this slide here how the votes were dispersed, kind of all over the place. And I think many were surprised to some extent that Bill Daley didn't end up in the top two. I could have a whole discussion about my own 19th ward and the role Jerry Joyce played in that, but that might be another story. But we ended up having Lori Lightfoot and Tony Preckwinkle in the runoff. So we knew we were going to have our first African-American female mayor after the general election. We can take a look at this map to see where the strongholds were. The blue areas for Preckwinkle, you kind of see down along the south side, Hyde Park down into South Shore. Importantly, you see Lightfoot. Where's Lightfoot winning? The north side, northwest side, and predominantly white areas. although hers was a very broad coalition. I'll skip this slide without going into it. In the runoff, for the runoff election in April, on policy issues, there wasn't a lot of space between the two of them. There might be some areas where you could find disagreement between them, but there were multiple debates, multiple forums. Eventually, he had the general election in February. The runoff was in April. By March, it looked like Preckwinkle was out of money and she was pulling her campaign ads. Preckwinkle was widely seen as the machine candidate because she was the head of the Cook County Democratic Party. Now, going back to some of Preckwinkle's history, she was really a reformer. So to see her now being, cast as the machine candidate, which she, strong arguments for why she would be called that. Just watching the evolution was quite interesting. Ultimately, in the end, Lori Lightfoot ended up winning every single ward in the city of Chicago, carrying every single ward. She won with 73, 74% of the vote in the runoff election. Turnout was relatively low, only 32%. You were talking about a ward election, only having 30% turnout. That's not unusual in local elections. I mean, this was this was like an open seat for mayor in Chicago, and we only got 32% of the vote. So, I mean, historically in local elections, there's a lot of voter apathy, lack of turnout. The February turnout, 35%, 35%, but in 2015, it was a little bit higher at 41%. I happen to live in the 19th ward. The 19th ward usually has like 70, 80% voter turnout, and we were down. We were only 50%. In the runoff, it was 57% in the general election. But nonetheless, Lori Lightfoot, as all good politicians should say once they win, we have a mandate. We have a mandate for change. And you can see, here's just the ward map. It can show areas where Lightfoot won stronger than others, but importantly, she carried all 50 wards, and that is a mandate. She carried all 50 wards. In terms of money, total funds, a little over 12 million. Preckwinkle actually had a little bit more. As I mentioned earlier, our treasurer and city clerk are elected independently. The treasurer actually went to a runoff election with Melissa Conyers-Irvin, who's married to an alderman, ended up winning that race. And Chicago currently has not only an all-female executive branch currently, but all-female women of color, which is noteworthy. No other US city has had this kind of diversity. So when we think about Chicago as sort of being, we don't think of Chicago as being very progressive. But when we look at who we've elected in the last election, it tells us a lot, particularly when we put ourselves in comparison to places like New York or LA. Without getting too much into the weeds, I want to make sure we have enough time. I could talk about each one of these ward elections forever, like what happened here, what happened there. Probably the biggest take from this is that there were 6 Democratic Socialists elected to Chicago City Council. Chicago has more Socialist City Council members than any other major city. And you can see the wards where they actually won. And I'll actually just end it there, and instead of going through all these slides, so I can actually see you guys and talk with you a little bit more about where we are today.
Okay, so we have time, 10 minutes to discuss. Thank you, Connie, for all of that. You can simply either raise your hand or unmute yourself.
Now, I think one of the things is I had somebody who's sort of political consultant, works a lot in Chicago politics, who something had happened, some vote that was coming up in city council, and they said, it doesn't seem like Lightfoot's good at her job. I'm like, she's not Rahm Emanuel or Richard M. Daley. That doesn't mean she's not good at her job. We're actually getting, and Dick's had quotes about this, like we're actually seeing democracy in city council, and that's not a bad thing.
So in the city council report, if we absolutely update it to the moment, there have been 84 divided roll call votes since the city council was inaugurated in May of 2019. There are multiple blocks in the city council, as the report spells out, and they include a machine block, a conservative block, a liberal central block, which are mainly the committee chairmen that head the committees of the city council, and of course the progressive block. Underlying them, there are also racial blocks. There's a Black caucus and there's a Latino caucus, but that means that Lightfoot has to assemble. There's no one block that just automatically supports her. So she has to get the votes usually of the Central Liberal and a majority of the Progressive Socialist bloc. Sometimes it's a different combination, but that's she's not lost. She's only lost one vote, which was a specific kind of procedural vote related to getting mayoral powers during the pandemic, and some others that have come up. But in the end, every single policy has gone through. What has happened is that she has to compromise frequently, that she may have to, behind the scenes or in the discussion, amend the legislation that was originally proposed. We will have a chance to come back to the city council in this complicated system, but she is carrying a majority in all of the divided roll call votes. There are about 2,000 votes a year. It means 1,900 some odd are unanimous, and over 2.5 years, it's only been 84 divided votes.
When you
Thanks,
say
Dick, and I
blocks,
realized that I did have a slide on that to share.
and when you say blocks, you mean just
Voting blocks, groups of people who vote together regularly and have a very similar voting pattern. And what passes for something like ideology or policy agreement. It's not as rigid as the Democratic and Republican parties in Congress at the moment.
okay.
Mitch, did you have a question?
Yeah, so this year, obviously, we're going to be remapping. The states just modified yesterday the maps, and I'll share a link because I've been really curious and following this really kind of religiously. If anyone else is interested in following to see what the current maps look like for the state, those are the most up-to-date ones on CapFacts. But obviously the wards are going to get redrawn here pretty soon, and this being kind of, and we've talked about this in the last class, but this being kind of an inflection point for the break in the machine politics, and on the state and the local level in a lot of ways, with the socialist kind of caucus growing in power too. What are we expecting for what the ward remap is going to look like? Is it going to be drastically different? Are we going to see more consolidation of power in some of the minority groups that have been kind of mapped out in a lot of different ways? I mean, I'm just looking for insight. I know that we don't really know anything yet.
So there are two things that are most likely to happen. First of all, there's probably going to be a fight, which may be compromised, between the Black and Latino caucuses, because the Blacks, the African Americans, are overrepresented in terms of their numbers, and Latinos or Latinx are underrepresented by at least 3 wards in the case of Latinx, and one could argue for more. Asians have no representative at all in the city council and are trying to get representation separately in Chinatown, which is now part of the 25th ward. So there's a big battle over what's going to happen that has to do with how many of this racial group or that racial group have a controlling voice in the city council. The second thing is every incumbent is fighting to save their own seat. So even though wards may look totally gerrymandered, just if you look at them, you'll know they are, like the second ward alderman still wants to get reelected. So redrawing the boundaries with significant changes, not so much in the overall population of Chicago, but where people live now, is going to be a battle. And there is already an independent map commission, but it has no force. There are a couple of other things at play. If 10 aldermen or more do not support the map that the majority alderman put forth, they can force a referendum between their map and the majority map. And that has happened once in Chicago history. So there's going to be a lot of backroom deals, and there's going to be a lot of fighting. And there is an independent map that will be released in a couple of weeks, but it doesn't have the political force behind it unless 10 aldermen at least agree. And Rodrigo, you had a question for Connie or Missy?
Yes, I don't know if I can ask this is regarding the chapter, sorry, about corruption. Can I ask a question about that, or it's for
Sure.
next?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I was wondering how you measure that, because there's like 2,000 convictions, and the way I see, you could measure conviction as a way of that the system is actually being clean, right? You're catching the wrongdoing, so to speak. I'm comparing to my country where you have no conviction. So if you put that on the table, you know, it will be like, yeah, it's good, but it's actually the opposite, right? So I was wondering is how you measure that in the United States, how you disentangle an active justice system from one that is like letting things go.
So
I feel like a smart politician will use that as a line to get elected. The system worked, it caught me, vote for me again.
No, yeah, in the sense that if you have convictions, not convictions in the sense of a sentence, like you were caught doing an act of corruption, right?
Mm.
So if a city has a very high index of convictions
Right.
you know, it could mean not that it's a very corrupt city, but actually the opposite. It's or you're in the process of cleaning the city, right? So I was wondering how you measure that.
Well, and I'll let Dick and Missy jump in since that's more their report, but the fact that the corruption still happened and it's still costing taxpayers dollars with every bit of corruption that happens. So the fact that we're catching them is great, but I will say for every one we catch, there's probably 5 we don't.
And it is the federal government that's doing this work, right? It's not the state governments. The Illinois state, you know, Illinois state has never prosecuted a corruption case. So that is some sort of like, I don't want to say independent or objective, but I hope you know what I'm saying. Like, if it's the federal government looking into all the 50 states and saying, you know, what's going and prosecuting it that way, it's not, I totally appreciate what you're saying is, you know, that sort of prosecuting of their own, which I think that's a good point, because in Illinois, our attorney general has not, you know, gone after any of these cases. And certainly at the local level, they could have gone after many cases, but they haven't. And so what the federal government does, and so that's maybe a good thing about federalism, what the federal government does is does that for us. But to Connie's point, for sure, there are many more that go unprosecuted.
this has been a wonderful presentation and a lot of good comments, and I'm glad everybody's so involved. The good news is you'll get to continue the conversation with Missy and I next week. Connie, we appreciate it. And if you'll send me your slides by an email attachment, I'll use the new version when I post it for the class. We will be continuing with the 21st Century Chicago book. Essentially today we covered mainly the social conditions and the political conditions. We still have the economic, the governmental, the metropolitanization, and the globalization. So stay tuned for the second chapter next week, and thank you all for being here. If any of you have questions about the class, I'll stay just a couple of minutes in case there's some mechanics you need to have answered about how the class is going. Thanks again, Connie, and thanks, Missy, and we'll look forward to seeing Missy again next week along with Betty and I.
Guys, thanks everybody, really appreciate it. And I'll try to join you next week as well.
Thank you. Have a good night.
See y'all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
I'm the urban
Connie,
planner.
you can go and I'll take care of the ones that are left. Thank you so much.
Right, thanks.
Go ahead, Rodrigo.
Yeah, so as if I understood correctly, nobody dropped out of the class, right? So I should ask my advisor for an independent study so I can get credit for this?
Yes, that's the ideal. So if your advisor will do it or anyone over in CUPPA will agree to just read your paper, that would be fine. Let me know immediately if that doesn't work. As far as I know, no one has dropped out. Hang on just a minute. I'll look in Blackboard and see what what it looks like there. Just 1 second.
Okay.
Because you're certainly fully participating, so. We didn't want to open it up for fear that the class would explode and get too large. I am showing at the moment that there are only 19 students in the class. So I think if you try and register, where you can get my permission easily enough, I think if you try and register tomorrow, you'll probably be able to register for the class.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay.
And just in case I don't, there is any material that is circulating on Blackboard, or it's just the readings that we have to
You got the syllabus that, yeah. So far, there's no material that isn't listed in the syllabus that you got.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Professor.
Send me an email if you get in successfully. In fact, there should be 2 seats available.
All right.
So you ought to be able to get in tomorrow. I'll certainly grant permission if there's any permission form needed.
All right. I'll check.
Okay.
Have a nice evening.
You too.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Alicia or Becky, did you have a question or comment? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.